Welcome and thank you for coming. My name is John Tobin. I'm one of the founders and on the board of the New Hampshire School Funding Fairness Project. And again, we really appreciate you coming tonight to hear about school funding and property taxes. And we have given this presentation hundreds of places, including here. But it's not the same presentation as it was before because we've learned from people like you, and we're continually changing it and adapting it, and so we're interested in your ideas about whether this makes sense and what we emphasize and what we don't. So again, thank you for being here. I have a fond place in my heart for Wolfboro these days because my daughter got married here a year ago last June. And we had a really wonderful time. And I also used to come here and represent clients as a young legal aid lawyer centuries ago. So we start out this presentation showing this picture of students, just to try to remind us and remind everyone that at the core, we are worried and concerned and hopeful for the students in New Hampshire's public schools. And these are some kids from Berlin, and we did a presentation up there, and some kids in a graphic arts class came up with that banner, and then they marched in a local parade. And this picture means a lot to me because these kids are serious. They care about their education, and Berlin is a place where it's tough for the reasons that we'll talk about. And then this is a picture of the other side, not the other side, but another side of it, elderly people and people on fixed incomes, and everyone who's a property taxpayer. So this is about students and it's about property taxpayers. And when I first got into the school funding issue, because I was a young legal aid lawyer, I was up in the North Country, I lived in Berlin, and I had a couple young kids, and I heard about the Berlin City School District was gonna have a budget hearing in City Hall. So I marched down to speak up about doing whatever they needed to do to provide my kids and other kids with a great education. And in those days, Berlin had a thriving school system. But when I got there, I saw some of my elderly neighbors in the room, and they were saying, we care about our schools, but we can't afford the property taxes. And that's when I learned as a young parent about this dilemma that New Hampshire puts people in. Parents and children and taxpayers. And now I'm an elderly taxpayer. So I've seen it from all perspectives, and we need to change it. So this is really what we're going to talk about, that neither taxpayers nor students are treated fairly by the current system. The problem, in fact, has been getting worse for almost 20 years, but especially in the last 10 years. The state has been retreating from its obligation. And the current system is unconstitutional, and I'll speak in a few minutes about the... Oh, yeah. If I didn't have... This thing doesn't work down there, otherwise I'd be down there, but I will stay away from the edge. I don't want to trigger anybody's anxiety. So I'll speak in a few minutes about the two current cases that are, again, trying to make the state accountable. So this is our agenda in a little more detail. I'm going to talk about the constitutional principles, then talk about how property tax system works in New Hampshire and the resulting inequities from town to town. Then I'm going to take a look at what the state currently provides for what it calls adequacy aid and show you how that compares with reality. Then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the consequences of the current system beyond just taxpayers and students. And then we're going to talk about some possible current steps. So the constitutional principles are basically boiled down to two pretty simple principles. The first is that the state of New Hampshire has a duty to provide a constitutionally adequate education, and that's a clumsy phrase, and I'll tell you what it means a little more detail in a minute, but it's the state's obligation to provide that education. And the other principle is whatever the taxes that the legislature picks to fund that, and they have broad discretion about which taxes, which combination of taxes, but whatever they pick, the rate has to be the same for taxpayers across the state to meet that constitutional duty. So what does constitutionally adequate education mean? It's actually a forward-thinking, expansive notion, and this is the essence of it. It's not just reading and writing and arithmetic. It's the things that students need to compete and succeed in the 21st century economy. So it's technology and health and world languages and all the things that our kids need to succeed in the local economy, the national economy, the international economy. So it's a very practical touchstone. It's not a crimped notion from a century ago. It's what do they need now? We want our kids to succeed. What do they need now? And the court has been clear that whatever the state defines, however the state defines that, it has to pay for it. It can't delegate that responsibility, the financial part, to local districts or towns. It can obviously delegate the performance of it. We have local school districts across the state, but the core funding has to come from the state. And again, whatever tax the legislature picks, the rate has to be the same. And in particular, if the state decides that it's going to meet its core duty with a property tax, the rate has to be the same across the state. And that principle really is it's a conservative principle, and the provision in the New Hampshire Constitution that requires our taxes to be proportional and reasonable was in there. It was put in the Constitution in the 1780s as a response to the English king's arbitrariness about taxes. So it's a principle, it's a conservative principle of limited government. The power of taxation is beyond putting people in prison. It's the most awesome power that government has. And so the people who wrote the Constitution wanted to limit that power because it's always subject to politics and the powerful, and say the taxes have to be proportional, they have to be reasonable. Yes? These are from the Claremont case interpreting the Constitution. Sure. She asked if the quotes up here are from the Constitution. They're come from the court case interpreting the Constitution. The Constitution regarding taxes says taxes must be proportional and reasonable. So, as I mentioned before, because things have been backsliding, there are two cases that have been brought again to, try to get the state to meet its duty. The first one is called the Conval case, and that's named after the Conval School District. That district and 4 or 5 others brought a case in 2019 challenging the funding formula. That case went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court sent it back for a full trial. That trial happened this past spring. We are waiting any day now. There could be a decision from that trial judge. It's very likely that that decision will be appealed. So a definitive answer from the New Hampshire Supreme Court is probably going to be in late 2024 or early 2025. The other case, the Rand case, is one that I'm involved in. And in that case, we represent taxpayers who are homeowners and business owners in Pennacook, which is part of Concord, in Hopkinton, in Newport, and in Plymouth. And in all of those places, the total property values are low, the tax rates are high, and these taxpayers pay more than they should. And so that's what that case is about. That case is now before the same judge. We have filed some motions to try to narrow it and clarify it. We're also waiting to hear from him about that. So that's the law and the Constitution. Let's talk about property taxes. If you look at this pie, this is where all the money that pays for public schools comes from. And in the 2021-2022 school year, we spent $3.64 billion on public schools in New Hampshire. And you can see the blue is this part of that expenditure that came from property taxes. The section local property taxes, those are the taxes that are known to everyone as the local school tax. Swept over there, the 10%, is the statewide education property tax. It's nominally a state tax, but it's assessed locally, collected locally, spent locally. The state never touches it. So it's really part of the property tax system. So you can see 70% of the money that funds schools comes from local taxpayers. And what the state provides is the green. And you can see up there the lottery. We see a lot of ads about the lottery, but it only provides about 4% of the cost. Adequacy aid is the state's response to the Claremont cases. And you can see again, in terms of the proportion of the cost, it's pretty small. So and this hasn't changed. It's actually gotten worse in the last 10 years. So this chart shows as school budgets went up, where did the money come from? And way over on the left, you can see that the new money to pay for schools in the 10 years that this covers, 600 million of it came from increased taxes on local taxpayers. And in terms of what the state kicked in, only 47 million. So you can see that in the last 10 years, the burden and the proportion of the expense of public education has been put ever more heavily on local property taxpayers. So this is a chart that sort of gives you the whole New Hampshire revenue picture. This is the property taxes, the business taxes, the room and meals tax, real estate transfer tax. So you can see how much each of them is. And the big one, the monster over there on the left, is property taxes. The top part is the SWEPT that I talked about. The sort of light blue, that's municipal and county taxes. That's all the taxes that pay for county government and local government, roads, the county jails, county nursing home. The biggest portion of the property taxes is the local school tax. And look at how much money that is. It's over $4 billion. And the second bar there are the two state business taxes. And an awful lot of the conversation in Concord in the media in the last 5 years has been about those business taxes. Whether to cut them or raise them a little bit. Look how small they are compared to the property tax burden. And more businesses pay more in property taxes than they pay in these taxes. And one thing you might say, if you were looking at this in terms of investments, you would say we don't have a balanced portfolio. We rely incredibly much on property taxes. And if the property taxes were even and fair, that might not be the smartest thing to do, but we'll see in a minute that they aren't. So how do we compare to other states in how much we use property taxes? You can see we're number one. We have the highest reliance of all the 50 states on property taxes. 64% of all the money that the state raises and the localities raise come from property taxes. So we are very dependent on that, much more dependent on it than any other state. And on the other side, how does the state do compared to other states in the proportion of funding for local public education? Guess what? We're last. In New Hampshire, we spend good money on public education here. We are probably in the top 10 or 15 around the country in terms of how much we spend per pupil. This is about where does the money come from? The money comes from local taxpayers because the state doesn't kick in very much. So again, we care about public education, we always have, and local taxpayers ante up and contribute to that. The state doesn't. So now I want to talk about how this system works for individual taxpayers and within different towns and comparing to towns. And the key idea, and it sounds nerdy, but it's actually pretty simple, equalized value per pupil. How much property exists in a district for each student. What's the value of the property when you take the total value of all the property and divide it by the number of students? What's the value per student? And this number gives us the ability to compare the wealth and the capacity of districts to districts. So here's a way to sort of explain it. And imagine an expense that a school district has. It's going to be the same anywhere. $10,000 worth of Chromebooks, $10,000 worth of equipment for a chemistry lab, $10,000 worth of electricity, something that's going to cost the same. In a place where the property value is $1 million, we can raise that $10,000 at a tax rate of $10 per thousand. But in a place where the property value is only $400,000, that same tax rate only raises $4,000. So what do we need to do in that place with the lower amount of value? We need to have a tax rate of $25 per thousand to raise the same amount of money to pay for the same thing. And it's simple math. It's a function of how much property is there to tax. And if there is less, then you have to have a higher rate to get to the same number. And that proportion, 1,000 to, or 1 million to 400,000, the discrepancies in New Hampshire are much greater than that. So this would be okay if the number of kids and the property values across the state were equal from district to district, but they're very different. So here's some numbers, and the top row is the state average. We have 160, in that school year, 2021, 2022, there are 165,000 students in public schools, and the average property value per kid was about 1.6 million. And that meant that the tax rate was about $9.74. You can see in Portsmouth, their equalized value was more than double that. So they could have, as you can see, a lower tax rate and raise a lot more money. And again, it's simple math. If you have a lot of property to tax, you can raise a lot of money with a lower rate. Look at Milford. Milford has about almost the exact same number of kids as Portsmouth. Very similar enrollment levels. But their equalized value is considerably less than the average. And it's a little more than 1/4 what Portsmouth is. So they have a tax rate 2.5 times Portsmouth, but even with that rate, they're raising 1/3 less money. And again, if you have a pot of money that's large, you can raise a lot of money with a low rate. Look at Claremont and Newport. Those places have very low equalized value, so they have to have very high tax rates. And even with those high tax rates, they can't raise the money. And as we'll talk about, there are consequences. There are consequences for students, most especially. So here's a chart similar to that with a lot of the towns in this area. And as you can see, the towns we put up here, by and large, their equalized value is the state average or more. But even within that, you can see the great differences. Look at the difference in the equalized value between Effingham and Tuftonboro. And so Tuftonboro can have a lower tax rate and raise a lot more money. So this is another way of looking at this, the local numbers the same. And the red line is the average, the state average. And you can see, and there are some local towns in here and some others, you can see that the differences are vast, and it's not like a 10% difference or a 50% difference. In some places it's 100% difference or 250% difference, which really magnifies either the ability to raise money or the inability to. So this graph came to us because of a question we got. And the question was, how many students and how many taxpayers live in the districts with below average property values? How many students and how many taxpayers suffer from the current system? And we didn't know the answer, but we went back and looked at it, and it turns out 3/4 of the students and 3/4 of the taxpayers live in districts that have below average property values, so they have to run faster and sweat more to keep up. And the ones in the below average part include all the cities in New Hampshire: Manchester, Concord, Keene, Nashua, Laconia, Berlin. The only cities not in that on that side of are Portsmouth and Lebanon. And so it's urban, it's rural. Huge proportion get hurt by the system. One of the places that people are surprised to hear about is Derry. Derry is a place that really gets hurt by this. They had a lot of development 50 or 60 years ago. They have a lot of kids, and they have low equalized value. They have to have high taxes, and they can't have high spending. So this is a little fun exercise. Which home has the larger tax bill? And you can see one of them's a waterfront home with 200 foot of shoreline and a bunch of bedrooms and bathrooms. The other one is a lovely cape. And these things are taken, I think, from Zillow. We didn't make them up. We just found them. But that's a cape with 2 bedrooms and 1.5 baths. You can see the great differences in the assessed values. The one in Brentwood is worth maybe a little more than 1/3 of the one in Freedom, but they pay the same tax bill. They pay the same tax bill. And that's because Freedom has a lot of property to tax, so they can do it at a low rate. So that's how the tax system works, and we have these municipal boundaries that are 200 years old, and one interesting thing about that is 100 years ago, the places that had the high values were the mill towns, the Claremonts and Newports and Manchester, because those mills were thriving, and it was before the blossoming of the recreational outdoor tourist stuff in New Hampshire. So when people were fighting about school funding in the 1920s, people were looking to the mill towns to help contribute to the cost of education in rural areas. Now, where's the high property values? In places that have a mountain or a lake or the sea coast, one of those things. And one of our colleagues did a study about this, because some people think, well, isn't this about making sure you have a lively commercial sector in your town? And it turns out that the places that have a greater proportion of commercial and business as compared to residential have higher tax rates. And I have a slide in there I can show you later if you want to see it. So now we're going to turn to talking about the state aid. What does the state provide? This slide shows what the state provided until this past July. They raised it slightly, but it really illustrates how it works. Every student across the state says can be educated for $3,700. And the state provides some extras for kids who receive free or reduced lunch. And that's not paying for the lunch. That's just a marker for poverty. That's just saying poor kids have more needs. We'll give districts more money. How do we figure out who's poor? We'll look at how many kids they have on free and reduced lunch. And then there's a smaller stipend for kids that are English language learners. Again, the assumption is they need more services as they learn English. And then an extra amount of money for kids that receive special education. And there was a 4th category for kids in the 3rd grade who didn't fit into any of those other categories, who was not proficient in reading. That 3rd grade category is now gone. But the average, so that $3,700, every kid in the state was entitled to that. The average, when you figure out all of these things, and not every kid gets these, the average that the state was providing per kid was about $4,800. The average cost was, depending on what you include, was somewhere between $18,000 and $20,000. So here are examples from New Durham and Wolfboro about what the expenditure is and what the state is paying. The blue is what the state is paying, and the green is the actual expenditure. So you can see the gap. Yes? That is, and we have a fun little exercise that we went through about that. The question was, is the adequacy number what the state is saying is sufficient to pay for adequacy? All that you need to spend to give kids an adequate education. And yes, that's what they say. So we did a study in Pittsfield about this. And we used, and we've repeated this a bunch of places, but this Pittsfield is a great example. The state said that Pittsfield ought to be able to get the job done in 2018 for $2.6 million, or roughly $4,600 per kid. And the school district budget for that year was about $10 million, or $17,000 per kid. So the exercise, and this was the business manager and the superintendent and some other people getting out the spreadsheets for the budget, the 500 line items, and say, what can we cut in order to get our expenditures down to the level that the state says is all we need? We're going to start cutting things until we'll have a budget left that comports with what the state says is all we need. So they started paring the budget. And these are some things they started with. Eliminate 5 of the 16 teachers in the elementary school. Eliminate all art, music, and phys ed. All school nurses. All transportation, no buses. One of the secretaries, eliminate business ed, consumer science, health. Eliminate one of the science teachers at the middle high school. Eliminate all buildings and grounds, maintenance. All foreign languages, counselors, half the custodians. And the thinking was, teachers are the core of this. We're going to start to cut all kinds of things so we can hang on to teachers. But this is what they started to cut. And I'm sorry to say, this is only the first page. They cut all the benefits for the teachers. They cut all field trips, all sports. They eliminated a whole bunch of paraprofessional positions. They eliminated all substitute teachers. So if the teacher is sick, no class. You can see no new technology, no equipment. And they kept going. All guidance personnel, no photocopiers, don't maintain the athletic fields. You can see all the things. And so after they made all those cuts, where were they? They were halfway there. That brought the budget, it cut the budget in half, but they had preserved a core of teachers. So what did they need to do to cut the other half to get down to where the level matched what the state said was enough? They needed to start cutting teachers. So they ended up cutting teachers, and in order to get down to the adequacy level, they were left with an average class size of 60 students. That's what the state says is adequate. And we've done this in Hopkinton, we've done it in Allenstown, we've done it in places, and it comes out the same. In Allenstown, they did it slightly differently. In Allenstown, they send their kids, their high school kids, 9 through 12, to Pembroke Academy. So they just decided to cut that so in Allenstown, the cuts weren't quite as draconian, 1 through 8, but you were done in Allenstown with public education after 8th grade. So you can see the number that the state says is adequate is absurd. So now I want to talk a little bit about the consequences of this. One of the consequences is teacher salaries. And there's been stuff in the paper about this recently. There's been stories about, there was a story this week in Franklin they don't have enough teachers. They lose a quarter of their teachers every year because the teachers can go somewhere else. And it's not that they go somewhere else and make millions of dollars, but maybe they make 60,000 instead of 40,000. So on the right are the brand new teacher salaries. If you have a bachelor's degree, on the left, on the right is starting out with a master's degree. And so again, you can see that there's an enormous difference. And that means that teachers move. And I've had people in some of the poor districts say, we're like the minor leagues. We're like Pawtucket. It's not Pawtucket anymore, it's Worcester, but they train them, they hire them and train them, and then when they have a few years of experience, they go to a district that can pay them more. And one of the factors these days is school loans. So teachers are making a sacrifice to be teachers in lots of ways, but the question is, how much of a sacrifice are we asking? And what are the consequences to the students? And one of the most poignant things in all these presentations that I've done was one we did in Pittsfield, where a young woman who was a recent graduate of Pittsfield High talked about her experience. And this was a smart person who has succeeded, but she said, we knew that our high school was not up to stuff as compared to other schools. When we traveled around for teams and events, we knew we didn't have much. And when other people came to our school, we could tell they thought we were not exactly the third world, but practically. And they knew that teachers left. They knew that the system didn't treat them as well as the system treated other kids in other places. Lots of them succeed anyway, but that's part of the consequences. The teacher turnover, ability of schools to offer courses. Pittsfield now has no foreign language courses. Up in Berlin, they had no chemistry courses. And then when you look at other schools that offer, Pittsfield has no AP courses. And not everybody needs an AP course, but there are a lot of things that those places don't have, and it just makes it harder for kids to succeed. And why are the kids in Pittsfield suffering from that? Not because anything they did, it's because they happen to live in a place that has lower property values. So this we put up here just to sort of show you how this works even within a school district. The disparities for taxpayers. And so let's just imagine there's a kid in Wolfboro and a kid from New Durham, and they're friends, they're buddies, and they take the same classes. Picture them as sophomores and they're in the same biology class and the same English class. They're getting the same education, right? They're having the same teachers, they're getting the same education. But their parents are paying very different tax rates for the same education. Very different tax rates for the same education. And regional school districts make a lot of sense. They were created in the 50s and 60s to enable rural areas to combine resources and be efficient and offer kids more of a range of education. They make a lot of sense, and they especially make sense these days with declining enrollments and population. But the system sometimes encourages them to break up because the wealthier towns will say, why are we carrying the poor town? And nobody wants to join with a poor town. When at one of the presentations up north, somebody got up and said, isn't part of the solution to this regionalization and efficiency and economies of scale? And we said, yes, that makes a lot of sense. Then the mayor of Berlin got up and said, no one will take us. No one wants to bring us into a regional district because we have a lot of needy kids and we have a low tax base. And so if you think that regionalization is a good idea or efficiency is a good idea, this system discourages that because they make it every town for itself. And going back to Berlin and Portsmouth, and stepping back a minute, whether you're a liberal or conservative, Democrat or Republican, I think we would all agree that a baseline of what we expect from our state government is that it fosters economic development across the state, that it's even-handed in the way that it would foster that development. It's not going to pick regional favorites. It's not going to pick some places it really wants to support and other places it hurts. But the current school funding system, which is by far the most enormous expenditure of public money, really discourages economic development in many places. And somebody said, again, referencing Berlin, but it could be Franklin or it could be any place. Why would a rational business person open a business in Berlin or Newport or Claremont where the tax rates are high and where the schools where their kids and their employees' kids are going are under stress or underfunded? They're going to go where there's a stable school system and lower taxes. So we have a state-created system that, in fact, very much does play favorites. It fosters the inequality in terms of economic development because of this property tax system and the enormous disparities. The Claremonts, the Newports, the Berlins are stagnating. They're struggling. They're not stagnating is not even, and that's not the only reason, but this system makes it worse. It aggravates it. So again, we have a system that is not setting up a level playing field. We have a state-mandated system that does not create a level playing field, but in fact discourages the development in some places and encourages it in another. And another example is housing. We've been talking for a long time in the state about the need for more housing, but it's also been clear for a long time, and I've heard town officials say this. They don't say it as loudly as they used to, but they used to say it understandably, honestly. We don't want more housing because we don't want more kids, because we don't want to pay the property taxes to educate those kids. And so public policy, our system, discouraged local towns from creating more housing. And it wasn't, that decision to do that was rational given the tax system. Yes, if you have more housing, you may have more kids, and you will have to pay for their education, and the state's not going to help you. So we have a system that has discouraged the development of affordable housing. And now all kinds of people, especially business people, to their great credit, recognize we need affordable housing. But we have a property tax system that discourages it because it puts the burden for any new kids in a town on those taxpayers, and in lots of towns, that's too much. So now we want to talk a little bit about what could be done about this. And again, going back to our pie, the problem with the pie is that huge proportion of the money is coming from a tax system where the burdens are really uneven, because that tax system depends on property values, and the property values are really uneven, so people pay really different rates and have a really different burden. So the state essentially has pushed down on local taxpayers a $2.3 billion cost. That's not all of what public education spends. There are certainly things in every school district, and the sort of silly examples are swimming pool, rock climbing wall, that are not the state's obligation. Those are local choices. But we think it's conservative to say that beyond what the state is providing now, it needs to provide about $2.3 billion to take the burden off local property taxpayers. And it's important to point out, this is not $2.3 billion new money on top of the existing tax system. This is to replace the unfair tax system. So the heart of the problem is to get the burden shifted from local taxpayers to the state government. It's the state government's responsibility. And obviously the state government will have to impose some taxes to meet that burden, but the taxes need to be fair. So a couple of years ago, the legislature created a school funding commission to look at this whole system, and they got some outside experts who had done this all over the country. And what did they conclude? They basically concluded what you all are seeing, that the current system is unfair to both students and taxpayers, that the districts serving the highest proportion of kids who are neediest they spend less, they have fewer resources. And those least wealthy districts have to impose the highest tax burdens. And so it hurts taxpayers, it hurts students in a profoundly uneven and arbitrary way. So we've lived it, we've seen it, and the outside experts looked at all the New Hampshire data and came to the same conclusion. So this is some proposals that were kicked around in the current legislative session, and this was some of the revenue ideas. Put the business tax rates back up to where they were. The legislature is determined to eliminate the interest and dividends tax, which is a tax on interest and dividends, and it's paid largely by people who are pretty wealthy. So people have the idea that you could increase the exemption and just have wealthy people pay that. We used to have an inheritance tax. We could have a tax on capital gains. We could do a financial transaction tax. We could have a true statewide property tax. And if we did that, the rate would be higher some places and lower other places. But everybody would be paying at the same rate. And we could have those two bugaboos, an income tax or a sales tax. We don't have to have either one of those to solve this problem. There's a whole menu of other ways to do this. Since we love our property taxes, maybe we should just have a fair property tax. So in the upcoming legislature, there are some interesting things being proposed. One of them is to take a look at the cost of special education. Special education is an amazingly expensive proposition for local school districts. And in the most recent year, we spent across the state $800 million on special ed. That's more than a fifth of the entire education costs, is those special ed costs. And the state basically contributes very little. The average cost of those is about $27,000, and the state contributes very little to that. So what happens, and you may understand this, especially in small towns, a family moves in with a special needs child that has expensive needs, and that busts the local school budget, creates a lot of resentment, understandably, hard feelings for that family. In other places, that burden would be spread around. It wouldn't fall arbitrarily on the people who happen to live near them in that town. So here's where we are. Taxpayers and students are not being treated fairly. We need to find a different way to raise that $2.3 billion so that local school taxes would be lower and the money would be raised more fairly. And this is really all about the legislature. It's really all about the legislature. And in 2024, the legislature is going to be looking at whether the state should pay for all of special ed. It's going to be looking at true state-funded property tax relief for people. One of the problems with most tax relief is done locally and paid for locally. So if the town of Wolfboro gives somebody some tax relief, their next-door neighbors have to pay more taxes. In other states, you have what's called a circuit breaker. Once your tax bill gets to a certain level of your income, the state makes up the difference so that the town gets the money it needs, but it doesn't come right out of the neighbors. So the legislature, one of the things in the legislature is a bill put in by someone from the Conval district to raise that state adequacy grant to about $10,000 per year. The most recent legislature raised it from $3,700 to $4,100. And it's something, it's $400, but if the total cost of an education is $20,000, it's not much. And so that's the we sort of sum this up. Taxpayers and students shouldn't be treated differently depending on their zip code and depending on 200-year-old municipal boundaries. So we urge people to take action. We urge people to talk to candidates for office, write letters to the editor, share a story. We have a newsletter that goes out that alerts people to what's going on. It's especially important to talk to your friends, but also talk to your legislators. And one of the cool things about New Hampshire is we have a whole bunch of legislators. We have one for every 300,000 of us. No, every 3,000 of us. So they are accessible. They are accessible. They listen. When I talk to people in the legislature, they will say, if they hear from 10 people on an issue, they really perk up. And when we have made the most progress in the legislature on this, it's when we have gotten people to do the simple thing of contacting their legislator. And to do that, you don't have to have the answer. You don't have to have a funding proposal. You just have to have a question. What are you doing about this unfair system? What do you propose? What are you willing to work on? Will you make it a priority? So I think I will stop there, and happy to spend all the time we need to answer questions.
Yeah. It needs the audio up there. Okay. Here you go.
I have a history question, actually. How did it ever happen that property taxes became the basis of funding education? I mean, it seems from the get-go that it was totally unfair and a ridiculous system to begin with.
That is a great question. People didn't hear it. How did we get to a place where property taxes fund education? Well, in an agricultural economy, property taxes funded everything. And the property taxes included taxes on people's herds and their assets. And that was where their wealth was. They weren't getting cash income. They had property wealth, essentially, that they made money on. And so the two business taxes were finally put in the 1980s to replace some taxes. There was a tax called the stock tax and other things that were really archaic. So it's a legacy of an agricultural colonial economy. And now we know,
Test.
in lots of ways, the fundamental question is, who has the ability to pay in a fair way? And now we know that most of us who are homeowners can't suck income out of our homes to pay our property taxes. The money we have comes from working or savings or Social Security or something like that. And so we all, in paying our property taxes, have to get that money from some other sources, and that's how we pay. But this problem exists around the country, around the country, although every other state has made much more progress than we have in taking some of the hit from property taxpayers.
Hi. Didn't New Hampshire used to have like donor counties or whatever, towns and things, and wasn't it Jeb Bradley that was thrilled that he got rid of that? And isn't that where this all big problem started? Because wasn't there years ago where there was this court case where this has been going on with the lack of funding? And how do other states pay? I mean, I've lived in Northern Virginia, I've lived in California, and they all have great, schools and stuff. So how do other states fund this stuff?
Those are two great questions. And let me start with the second one. Her second question was, how do other states fund education? They fund education through income taxes, sales taxes, some of the other things that we have on our list. They also have an inheritance taxes. A lot of them have capital gains taxes. A virtue of capital gains taxes and interest and dividends taxes is you can structure it so you're really taxing people who clearly have the ability to pay. And in lots of states, it's a blend of a bunch of different things. They don't rely all on one. They rely on a combination of them. And again, in New Hampshire, our overall tax burden is low, but our property tax burden is among the highest. So we could have a system where our overall tax burden remained low, but it didn't fall so hard on property taxpayers. Let me go to the donor town thing. And let me just take you back and have you think about that. Nobody thinks about donor towns with respect to the county jail or the county nursing home. I live in Concord. When I pay my county tax, I don't think about how many people in that jail are from Concord and how many of them are from Boscawen, and I only want to pay for the ones in Concord. Or how many people in that nursing home are from Bow or somewhere else and not Concord, and why should I have to pay for them? Everybody understands that the obligation to pay for those things is a common obligation across county lines. And another way of sort of thinking about this is, I live in Concord. We have a lot of hotels and restaurants, so there's a lot of rooms and meals tax collected in Concord. That doesn't all stay in Concord. It goes into the state and gets spent where it's needed. Bow has very little of that. If they had to rely on what they got from rooms and meals, they would be hurting. And so when you think about the obligation to pay for education, it's a state obligation. It's not, and we all have an obligation to all of the kids in this state. There was a great book written a few years ago by a guy who's looked at this, and the name of the book was Our Kids. They are all our kids. And one of the things that the court said in one of the decisions was, the kid that grows up in Pittsfield isn't necessarily going to stay in Pittsfield all her life. She may get a job in Portsmouth. She may move somewhere else. And we all have a stake in having her have a great education so that she can do that job well and be a good citizen wherever she lands. So the donor concept was essentially people saying, we don't want to pay anything toward the education of kids outside of our towns. And so when the first round of court cases was over, one of the solutions was this statewide property tax. And the idea was there's going to be a rate that everybody pays, and that money's going to come into the state and be redistributed. Then they changed it so that the money gets kept locally, and in the places where there's so much property worth, they could raise more than they needed for their local students with their property taxes. And that's when they said, we don't want to send that money to pay for the education anyplace else. And it wasn't that they were paying extra, they were just paying the same rate as everybody toward kids. So what happened about 12 years ago is the legislature went along with that. And so now what happens is those wealthy towns get to keep that money. They get a bonus. And they can spend it on local schools. So in essence, their taxpayers pay at a lower rate. And I can understand the appeal of that. I'm loyal to Concord. When I lived in Berlin, I was loyal to Berlin. But we have an obligation to spend fairly for all of our kids. And another question that I get that's sort of similar to that is, I don't have any kids in schools. I don't have any stake in this. Why should I have to pay? And my answer to that is going back to 1954 when I started kindergarten. My parents didn't pay. I certainly didn't pay. Some other people of multi-generations paid for my public education because we in the society have an intergenerational commitment and compact to educate our kids. And without that, we're going to fall apart. So I understand, the sort of consumer mentality. I don't want to, there's an insurance company that says you only have to pay for what you get. But we're not talking about private insurance. We're talking about education, which is an important public good. And one of the most important functions of it is to teach our kids how to operate in a democracy and to have them have the experience of being with all kinds of other kids and learning how to get along and operate. So it's the right to an education is really, there's no other right like that in New Hampshire. And this is true in a lot of other states. This right to an education, the Constitution and the courts say this is so central to democracy and to a functioning society, it has a high priority. And it doesn't stop at the town line. So.
Where is the state finding the money for this voucher system? And is that coming out of the money that would have gone to our public schools?
The money for the voucher system is coming out of the state funds that are meant for public schools. The irony is that the state's funding level is so low that there's money in there because they've basically said we don't have to spend very much, so we've saved some money. But let me put the voucher thing in perspective, and this is not a program about vouchers and to debate them, but let me just put it in perspective. As you saw, there are about 160,000 students, public school students. Now this voucher program has, I think, somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 students, so it's a very small number of students. The majority of them, the Department of Ed's data shows, were in private school already. And now the legislature's made a decision that we're all going to help pay for that private school. We can talk all night about that decision, but in terms of this, the big picture is public schools. That's where the kids are. That's where most parents want their kids to be. There is certainly a debate to be had about vouchers and whether they help people, and there's certainly a debate to be had about whether we want to support various religions. That part of it may be over because the U.S. Supreme Court is breaking down that barrier. But the other thing about the voucher thing that I just find interesting is there's no accountability. Public schools have a lot more accountability. They have rules and standards. They have to take everybody. The vouchers, I mean, I saw some data about how much money in vouchers is being spent on at ski resorts and on Amazon buying things, and there's no accountability. But again, that's not the big picture. That's a noisy picture, and there's valid debates to be had and understandings to be had. But the real interest and importance is those 160,000 kids in public schools and the taxpayers across the state and how this works.
So none of our representatives from Wolfboro are here tonight, and I think that one of the things that I, as a citizen of this town, even though I see the logic in all of this, I think the messaging that we're getting is, no taxes, let's lessen our taxes, and that message resonates with people because they're like, well, I don't want any new taxes. So anytime you show a slide that says, well, we need to increase the revenue of the state, I can tell you right now that this town is, the majority of the people in this town are going to say, no, I don't want any new taxes. And maybe it's a, short-sighted viewpoint, but it's a valid viewpoint that a lot of people have. They don't want to give any more money to the state. So what do you have to say about that?
That's a great question. It's a great New Hampshire question. It really is. I guess what I would say is we're paying that $2.3 billion now. And different people are paying it at different rates in different places, and it has all the consequences that we can see. And So what we're talking about is not raising more government money. We're talking about raising in a different way so that the burden on people is less. And one of the things, I didn't talk about so much is the current system. New Hampshire's population is stagnating. The proportion of population here that's elderly is growing. The only reason that we're not, and for the last bunch of years, we've had more deaths than births. The only reason we're not absolutely flat or shrinking is because people from Massachusetts are continuing to move here, but it's very small. And so we're not among, sort of a basic thing that we need to do as a state is not snuff ourselves out demographically. We need to have policies and things that encourage families to move here and have kids. And so we have people who work in the nursing homes and can take the jobs that we need. And when you talk to business people, we've done this presentation at the BIA, the Business and Industry Association. Their biggest thing is not taxes. Their biggest thing is workforce. They're not so worried about paying more taxes. A lot of politicians think they are, but when you actually talk to them, no new taxes, no more taxes is not their highest priority. Their highest priority is we can't find the people to work in our businesses. They're not moving here. If they move here, they can't afford housing. They can't find housing. So we need to step back from the thinking that we've had that if we just keep taxes low, all will be well. All is not well. Other states have recovered from the recessions quicker than we have. Other states in New England, Massachusetts has recovered much more robustly than New Hampshire from the recessions. And so we need to look at our demographics. We need to look at what policies we can do to foster young families, to foster business growth, to grow our workforce. And this system, just right off the bat, doesn't grow the workforce in all the places where people aren't going to want to open businesses. So this system, keeps taxes low in a certain way, but it also it's leading to a slow decline in our population, and it's leading to very much a decline economically in a lot of the parts of the state. Wolfboro, I love Wolfboro. I love coming here. It's lovely. It's the exception in lots of ways. And that's because you have a beautiful lake, and God bless you. But the rest of the state, we have this big problems of workforce. We have big problems about an aging population, stagnant growth, and this system is making that worse. And so I'm happy, I get it about nobody wants taxes, but I think we need to figure out, well, can we shift the tax burden? Can we change the tax burden to accomplish some things that we also want? Sure.
So could we say that if we shift the tax burden, we can lower property taxes? Because we have a very, well, I don't know how it's going to go coming up. Our county tax is going up 24%, not good news. We have very low property taxes here comparatively, so you're not going to get a really big fan base here of like, yeah, let's do a statewide tax of 10%, whatever. But in messaging, again, would that be, if we shift the burden, we can lower your property tax? Is that true?
Yes, I think we can lower taxes. And the other thing I guess I would say about Wolfboro's property taxes, yes, they are lower than a lot of other places in New Hampshire. They are higher than property taxes in a lot of other states, even here, because we rely so much on them. So that, yeah, your property taxes are lower than a lot of places in New Hampshire, but they're higher than a lot of property taxes in lots of other parts of the country. And we're competing with our kids with Kansas City and Charlotte, North Carolina, and places in Texas. That, to my mind, that's urgent. And yes, our property taxes are lower than, the property taxes here are lower than they are in Berlin. Our energy costs are high. So, we need to do whatever we can do to lower the costs where we can of housing, of living. And so, the burden really falls on equally, and there are ways to get the new revenue. There are ways to bring in the new revenue that don't require higher property taxes, but they might require taxing income in some way. So those are the choices that the legislature should be debating. But the status quo, the New Hampshire advantage is crumbling, it's stagnating. Our demography says it's crumbling. Our aging population, our trouble with workforce. And again, the business people, our business leaders say the issue is not taxes. It's who's coming here and who's leaving. So.
I think the way the question is being framed for me, what I'm hearing, is that there's no diversification in the example you're giving. And that's one of New Hampshire's problems. It doesn't have, at the local level, there's no ability for the town to develop alternative ways of raising money. They have very limited options. The state has many more options. And given the fact that this is a statewide responsibility, it's the state's responsibility to use its ability to raise money in 10 or 20 different ways or 30 different ways, rather than saying the town has to raise it and it has one option or two options. The other problem is that you get a tax bill and it says that you're paying a statewide property tax. And so people think they're pitching in, but you're not. So there's that misunderstanding that you're not really sending any money to help out anybody else. And you're saying if you live in Tufton Borough with a low tax rate, I don't want to pay any higher taxes, property taxes, but you in fact are paying lower tax rate because somebody else is paying for the property that they own on that waterfront that's worth $1 million. So you're saying, I don't want to do it, but I want my neighbor to do it. So I think there's so much inequity in that statement that says, I don't want to pay anymore, and so much misunderstanding about what a diversity of funding sources the state has opposed to the local level. But I would also bring it back to the fact that people think that their child's education is a local management issue with local school boards and local control. And if the state is paying, what is that going to do? And I would also ask that question in a different way, which is, we have unfunded mandates from the state that says our school has to provide transportation, but we don't include that in the cost of a basic education. Or the school has to provide for a school nurse, but that's not included in the cost of the education that we use for $4,100 or whatever they state. So the state has the obligation. It makes us pay for things it doesn't pay for in defining the obligation, and then has much more flexibility in its ability to collect money to pay for it.
Great questions and great statements. And let me go to the unfunded mandate part first, and just tell you that in the Conval trial, the state was arguing, basically they were arguing you don't need a building. You don't need all this other stuff. All you need is a teacher out in the meadow teaching. I mean, basically that's what they were saying, because they didn't want to admit that they were responsible for buildings or nurses or all kinds of things. And the state has a whole array, as you say, of unfunded mandates, a whole bunch of requirements that public schools must follow, or they lose their ability to operate. But the state doesn't pay for those. So absolutely, it's an unfunded mandate. Let me just talk about local control and just say it sort of quickly. The people in Pittsfield don't have local control. They have local control of what, do we eliminate all AP classes or all foreign language classes? And whatever we do, we're going to lose a third of our teachers because they can't ask more of their taxpayers. Their taxpayers are already paying way up here, really sweating, being heroic. But even doing that, they can't compete with teacher salaries. They can't offer things. So for them, local control is a mirage. It's a myth. It's an illusion. If resources were level, then Pittsfield and the other places could say, well, do we want our kids to take Chinese or Japanese? Do we want to emphasize vocational things or college prep? There are a lot of different choices that local districts could make if the playing field were level. But the playing field isn't level, and when you hear what is going on in some of these districts, it's heartbreaking. It's just really heartbreaking. And some of the school districts they're faced this terrible choice under their current system if they're not property wealthy. They can either really hit their taxpayers hard and try to raise a halfway decent amount of money, or they can try to give their taxpayers a break by capping the property taxes. And a few places have done that, Manchester and Franklin being the most notable examples. And the school districts in both of those places are really in crisis. They are in crisis. And if you read the papers about Franklin, or you go there, or you talk to people familiar at all, the Manchester School District, that's our largest school district, and it is failing by every metric. And you can understand why the powers that be in Manchester said, we just don't want to hammer our taxpayers any harder. The tax rates in Manchester are still higher than Portsmouth because Portsmouth has so much wealth they can have it both ways. In Manchester, they decided to have a sort of a low tax rate and really hurt their schools. And so local control is really, for most of the school districts in the state, is a set of terrible choices. And we could actually have more local control if we had more equitable division of resources. Okay, let me just ask her if she can go first.
So how are you funded, one? And two, with that funding, how do you get the legislature to understand this? I think thanks to you, most of us in this room understand, but the legislature is a pretty big dysfunctional unit. Sorry.
I think it's really about politics. It's about local democracy, and I'm optimistic about that because I think in New Hampshire we have a better shot at that than in California or New York, with vast populations and legislators who are really remote. And we have seen this legislature turn on a dime about things when they heard from enough people. And so I think we can, and the other thing about this that makes me optimistic, this is not a new issue, and this is not esoteric. School taxes and taxes in general, and property taxes especially, have been simmering, slowly coming to a boil for a long time. So I think this is one of those places where there can be a tipping point. And I think the way to get there is just all of us talking to our legislators. And let me just be a little specific. I've known Jed Bradley for a long time. He's a smart guy. He understands this. He came to one of these 3 or 4 years ago, and sitting here without his legislative colleagues around, he could get it. He did get it. But then when he and his colleagues go to Concord and they do their group think, they don't get it. So, but I never want to write anybody off. And I think we need to go to them and say, this just can't go on anymore. You need to fix it. There's a whole array of ways to fix it, but you need to fix it. And if you don't fix it, the future of the state becomes more problematic. So get the conversation a little bit away. And I think you can say to him, I don't think people are as worked up about, business people are not as worked up about taxes as you think. They are worked up about workforce and housing, and this system puts a big lock on that. So I think we can persuade people. I think we need to change the conversation. And the legislators need to hear from a range of people. They need to hear with people who have kids in school. They need to hear from elderly taxpayers who care about this intergenerationally. They need to hear from business people who say, you know, a functioning school system that's paid for fairly is vital to our state, and you need to make it happen. So I think we can make it happen. Beg pardon? Oh, how we're funded. We get a variety of grants from some foundations and we also get donations from people, and people who believe in this mission. Some people have been working on it one way or the other for years, and some of the foundations that support us used to try to stay away from this, but they've been persuaded that this is vital and urgent, and that this issue needs to be addressed. So we're nonpartisan. We don't we don't endorse candidates or diss candidates. All what we say that you should do is talk to the candidates and legislators. You talk to them, and that's actually more effective than us talking to them anyway. What legislators want to do is they want to hear from the people in their districts. They get swamped with emails from all over the country, but what they listen to is people from their districts.
So I just want to quickly say that here in Carroll County, we have 4 of our legislators sitting on the HEC, the Education Committee, House Education Committee. Of the 4, we have Michael Belcher, we have Glenn Cordelli, and we have Katie Peternell. So they are not really the voice where we can be voicing our concerns about public education, especially considering Mr. Cordelli, we know, tried to dissolve our school districts, amongst other things. So I'm going to encourage people, if they want to reach out about public education, probably our best bet is reaching out to Steve Woodcock, who is also in Carroll County and is probably our best legislator for being able to reach out to.
And I guess I would say again, you may not change Mr. Cordelli's mind, but I think it's a very useful thing for him to hear from a lot of people. Because even the most ideologically fervent legislator, they still want to get reelected. They still want to at least give the sense that they're listening to their constituents. And so I think it's still worth, contact him and talk to him. Don't have expectations that he's going to change his mind. But I think don't write anybody off. Let them all hear from you, and then that's the way you start to change things. So back there, and then here, and then there. You.
This is just really quick. You mentioned questions that we can ask, but that was very fast. Are the questions, when we talk with the people who we should be talking to, are they on your website?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about this. Yeah, so everybody who signed in on the sign-in sheet, I'm going to send a follow-up email to. So that'll have this presentation in it, a link to our website. And on our website, we have a whole page that has resources on how to write letters to the editor. It has our staff's contact information. So if, based on what you see on the website, you still have additional questions, you can reach out to me directly. I'm the Outreach and Engagement Director. My name's Casey. My email is cneal@fairfundingnh.org. So any questions that you can't find the answer to on our website, you can feel free to reach out to me directly, but we do have a lot of resources for advocates on the website. And in addition to you guys kind of independently reaching out to your representatives, a lot of the time during the legislative session, we have advocacy tools that'll be up. And so those are usually targeted
at specific things that are going on in the legislature. So those bills that John was talking about, as they come through, and as we need to make like big pushes for legislators to hear from their constituents, we'll have forms up that all you have to do is just put in your information, and it has a canned message that you can edit, and it'll send it directly to the either your representatives as things are going to the full House and Senate, or to specific committees. So if you sign up for our newsletter, or if you circled no and change your mind, you'll still get an email from me, and you'll be able to figure out how to do it on the website. But so the short answer to that is yes, it's on the website. And if you have any other questions, you can just contact me directly.
Yeah, I just can't emphasize enough that it doesn't take a lawyer to get a politician to listen. And it actually, lawyers get in the way sometimes. They want to hear from you. You all have your voices. You don't have to have it down to the, comma. If you just say, I'm concerned about school funding and property taxes and fairness and the future, and what are you going to do about it? And put the onus on them. They know about this. And you don't need to debate with them. Just hearing from you that you care about and you want change that's action. That's good. Letters to the editor are great, and again, it doesn't have to be a college essay. It's just why you think what you think, short and sweet. And the more vivid you can make it about what you've seen and observed, the better. But we can do this. We can do this. You had
I just have an anecdote. We were in Tanzania this summer, and we went to a school, middle school, 97 kids in the classroom, 4 kids to a desk. Just thought you'd be interested in that. As bad as it is maybe here, these kids are studying in those kind of conditions. It was amazing. That room was crowded. But they had a welcome song for us, in spite of all that.
Historically, we've had a very good public education system here. We have, and our test scores and all that stuff show that. But it's starting to fall apart, and it's first falling apart in the Franklins and Manchesters and Allenstowns. It's starting to fall apart in the Keens and Derrys, and so we need to save it. We need to save it and bring it into the 21st century and how we pay for it. So.
Yes, so the proof of that is in the fact that our ratings in the U.S. News and World Report rankings for the education in the state of New Hampshire have fallen in the last 6 years. Coincidentally, in relationship to our Commissioner of Education, which may or may not have any relationship, but the same time period. And so you're countering a history of having high scores with what was seen as low cost, particularly at the state level, which was a little bit of one of those shell games, right? And then on top of it, you have this whole movement of people who I think you have to speak to about choice, who have gotten on this bandwagon that the solution is not public education, or if it is public education, it's all about choice. And the one comment I would make about that, and you can maybe reflect on it, is choice in and of itself is no magic bullet. You can have a choice between 2 bad options. So saying choice is the solution is not a solution, A, and B, it doesn't indicate that anyone has paid attention to whether or not the choice is addressing whatever the need is. So the other part of the argument is, our schools aren't serving the needs of our students, or more specifically, my student. But in that expression, what has been identified as the need of the student that isn't being addressed, and is the best solution for addressing that need, whatever you think needs to be offered as an option or a choice. So is that charter school going to address that need? That's never part of the question question and answer process. It's simply, oh, if I have another choice, that means it'll address the need. So I think the conversation has to get even beyond just saying it's not fair, it's not treating kids fairly, it's not raising the next generation the way we collectively need them raised in our state. It's, you know, the idea that parents know best, that they know what their kids need, and they know that this other option, which they know nothing about, is going to serve that need. So it's a whole, in our representatives that you were, it's a whole argument that they have around choice and charter and homeschooling and freedom, you know, and vouchers that that they think addresses all of that, that doesn't address the 160,000 kids in the public system.
You're absolutely right. And one of the things I guess I would say about the voucher movement is that they are a very loud but very small minority. And they have, through the way our political system works these days with money flowing, they have a lot of people in our legislature, not just here, but across the country, under their sort of ideological thrall. But most people in New Hampshire still care about public schools. They want their kids to go to public schools. They see that public schools are really vital to their communities. Let me tell you about the experience I had in Croydon. Maybe you heard about the situation in Croydon where at a snowy school district meeting where not very people were there, the Free Staters succeeded in passing a vote to cut the budget more than in half. And Croydon's a pretty, you know, it's a conservative Republican town. But the people in Croydon rose up against that. And it wasn't just the liberals and it wasn't just the teachers, it was the Trump voters and the Republicans, because they all cared. That school was central to them. They had gone there. Their kids had gone there. They wanted their grandkids to go there. And it was the community. And that people feel that way about public schools. It's not just, they're central. And so what happened in Croydon is the people in Croydon rose up, and the vote, they had to go through the legal rigmarole of persuading their school board to call a meeting. I went to that meeting. It was like, the vote was like 350 to 4, you know? All of that, when the schools are really threatened, people do rise up. Right now, we're all busy, we're not paying attention, but I really think that people care about their public schools, and I think that the attack on them it's insidious and it's well-funded, but I don't think it has yet persuaded very many people that we need to tear down our public schools. Our public schools are too important to us all. So. We need it on the microphone so that he can record it.
Okay, there's an argument out there that says we allow our public schools to persist in spite of the fact that they're failing. And I have expressed in innumerable times how many schools, public schools, in fact, have been flunked and been restructured and had to reorganize. But I've also pointed out that the charter schools that have come in have equally failed. And so they just came out recently, every 3 years they evaluate the schools in the state. And in the state, there are X number of schools that have been put on, you know, probation or whatever you want to call it. And X number of those are charter schools. And the percentage of charter schools, because there's such a small number of charter schools, albeit, that are in the list of failing is higher than the ones in the public school. So the illusion that a charter school is the answer is another one. It never fails to amaze me. We've had legislation in New Hampshire that allows you to have charter schools for like 25 years. The first ones, all of the initial ones, all have closed. They don't exist anymore. The average lifespan of them is like 5 years. So what's the illusion of, and I'm not suggesting that there aren't great charter schools out there, there are. and they've succeeded in producing great students. But in the state of New Hampshire, the majority of the charter schools have a lower graduation rate than the high schools that are public high schools, but nobody's representing that.
You did. Yeah. Let me just say this, and this goes back to what we can say to people who seem to be pretty dug in. You have some legislators that are pretty dug in. I would say our State Board of Education and the commissioner are pretty dug in. But I think you can say to them, you can speak limited government, accountable government talk to them. You can say, we want you to study, we want you to compare these things. We want to know about the results of the vouchers. If you're going to spend our money, we want you to study this and report on it. You can't just let that money disappear. And that's a hard argument for them to respond to. And I think, as you said, I think when the data comes out, we're going to find out that a lot of that money is wasted, that educationally a lot of it is hooey. But if you can't persuade them to do anything else, I think you can lean hard on them speaking their own language. I mean, they say every other government program should be accountable and should be studied and should report and should be efficient. Vouchers should too. So if you happen to talk to Representative Cordelli and you get nowhere about changing the funding system, ask them some questions about accountability for vouchers. They are not crazy radical questions. They are conservative questions. How are we spending that money? What are we getting for it? What do we know? Where's the transparency? Where's the data? Those are good questions to ask. So I think we should probably stop. Oh, yes.
Just because we're on all this. I would encourage everyone also to look up the education standards, the 306s. They're rewriting them, and I think that's pretty important for people to voice their opinion on. Extremely important. So our 306s right now is a pretty big issue.
306 is the state has regulations that the regulations we were talking about, all the standards and rules and requirements that the state imposes. Right now there's a movement to weaken those and water them down and disappear some of them. I think as a backhanded way of saying the state shouldn't have to pay for them because they're not important. So have been some public hearings about this proposal to weaken them, and the State Board of Education is looking at that. So we need to, again, put pressure on that board and the commissioner and our reps to say, we don't want them weakened, we want them funded. So, thank you all very much for coming.